Have you ever imagined that losing everything could be the gateway to a new world? Meet Amelia, a young nurse with a fiery heart who traded her career to save a life, only to be dealt a cruel twist by fate, fired on that very fateful day. But don't scroll past just yet. As the twilight sun had yet to fade, 10 luxury cars suddenly pulled up in front of her house, and the mysterious man she once saved, Nicholas Edward, stepped out with an offer that would turn her life upside down. From trembling hands in the emergency room to a dream of leading a boundless hospital, Amelia's story is a dance between loss and hope, where every stumble brings her closer to the light. Will you stick around to see her work miracles? Don't look away, because sometimes the darkest days are the beginning of the greatest things. That fateful day began like any other in Amelia's life. A young nurse with eyes blazing with faith and a heart beating to the rhythm of healing. She had just clocked out from an exhausting shift at the hospital, where the corridors were always a chaotic symphony of life and death. The shouts of doctors barking orders, the rustle of nurses flipping through charts, the groans of patients in pain, all blended into a familiar melody Amelia had memorized by heart. To her it was just another ordinary day, or so she thought. But fate, like a cunning and masterful director, had quietly set the stage for a drama in which she had yet to be cast. Then the emergency room doors burst open like a whirlwind. A stretcher barreled in at breakneck speed, its wheels screeching against the floor, carrying a man, his pristine white shirt now stained with dark red blood, like crushed rose petals. The medical staff shouted vital signs, their voices cracking in the stifling air. Multiple gunshot wounds. Needs immediate assistance. The atmosphere in the air thickened, taut like a string about to snap. Amelia stood there, her heart pounding as if it might leap from her chest, her eyes locked on the stranger. His breaths were shallow like a breeze skimming a lake's surface, his face pale as wax, his body slipping toward death. Without a command, her feet moved forward, her hands reaching for gloves, her healer's instinct drowning out all hesitation. But then a voice, cold and sharp as a blade, sliced through the room. No police clearance, no treatment. The hospital director, his face hard as stone and arms crossed with authority, stood like an immovable statue amid the storm. Amelia froze, her eyes scanning the room for a spark of defiance from her colleagues. But there was none. Nurses bowed their heads like timid birds. Doctors stepped back as if dodging a curse. The sporadic beeps of the heart monitor sounded like a countdown to death. The man on the stretcher was now just a fading silhouette, his chest barely rising. Amelia's breath caught, as if she too were losing life. Within her a fierce battle erupted. The oath to save lives, etched deep in her heart, clashed with the hospital's brutal reality. Defying orders meant burying her career, but standing still meant letting a soul slip away. Her hands trembled, yet her gaze was resolute. Then, like a warrior crossing the line between life and death, she lunged for the medical tray. The air fell silent, save for the clatter of metal as she pulled it toward her. The sharp scent of antiseptic stung her nose, but she didn't care. Her hands moved swiftly to secure his airway, pressing hard to stem the bleeding, each motion a dance choreographed by fate. A timid nurse stepped forward, whispering, "Amelia, you can't." But she cut her off, her voice shaky yet firm. "I have to." The machines beeped wildly as if cheering her on, and Amelia plunged into the fight for his life, ignoring the stunned stares and the director's ragged breaths behind her. She stitched wounds, stabilized his heart, sweat pouring down her forehead like rain. And then a miracle. The numbers on the screen steadied. His breathing returned, faint but tenacious. He lived. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, the steady beeps of the machines ringing out like a victorious hymn. But the joy was fleeting. A slow, icy clap echoed from behind. Amelia turned to face the director, his eyes sharp as steel, his voice cutting. "Well done, Amelia. You saved him. But you no longer work here." His words stabbed her heart, their weight choking her. The sterile walls of the ER seemed to close in, crushing her in the very place she'd given her youth. Her colleagues stayed silent, none daring to defend her. Amelia clenched her fists but held her head high. If this was the price for a life, she'd pay it willingly. She set the tray on the counter and walked out of the hospital, her heart thumping, the future a murky void ahead. As dusk fell, Amelia wandered the streets, her steps slow like those of a lost soul. The fading golden sunlight stretched her shadow across the pavement, but she barely noticed. Just hours ago she'd been a devoted nurse, Now she was nothing. Her hand absently brushed the hospital ID in her pocket, that small piece of plastic, the last remnant of a golden era. She didn't throw it away, perhaps because some corner of her soul wasn't ready to let go. She sighed, trying to shake off the sting of betrayal, and drifted into the city park, an oasis of peace amid the gray concrete jungle. The sound of children's laughter and the scent of freshly cut grass floated by, as if to soothe her bleeding heart. But fate, ever the mischievous player, wouldn't let her rest. A piercing scream jolted Amelia from her daze. She turned to see a small crowd gathered near a bench, their faces pale with fear. Pushing through, she saw him, an elderly man, trembling hands clutching his chest, his face ashen as if dissolving into nothingness. He staggered, then collapsed. Amelia's heart pounded like a war drum. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. Her fingers pressed his neck. No pulse. Time froze, the world blurred, leaving only her and this stranger. She interlocked her hands, placed them on his chest, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each press was a prayer, each beat of sweat a hope. The crowd murmured, someone sobbed, someone filmed, but Amelia heard nothing but her own counting. "Come on, sir, stay with me," she muttered, her voice hoarse. After 30 presses, she tilted his head back and gave 2 breaths. His chest rose, then fell. She kept going, relentless, until a faint, gasping breath broke through. His eyes fluttered, his body twitched faintly. He was alive. The crowd exhaled, the distant wail of an ambulance growing nearer. Amelia slumped back, adrenaline still surging but joy flooding her chest. "Can you hear me?" she asked gently, resting a hand on his shoulder. He nodded weakly. A man in an elegant suit suddenly knelt beside her, introducing himself as the man's assistant. "You saved Mr. Edward," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Please let me have your information." Amelia hesitated. The name Edward stirred something vague, but she was too exhausted to think. She pulled out her ID, handed it over, then stood, brushing dirt from her crumpled scrubs. The crowd still stared, whispering in awe, but she didn't wait for praise. With a final glance at the ambulance, she turned away. Just 5 hours later, as darkness cloaked her small apartment, 10 gleaming luxury cars, like proud iron steeds, rolled up to her doorstep. Their engines roared, shattering the quiet, their headlights bathing the shabby street in light. Amelia, still weary and bewildered, stepped onto her balcony, hardly believing her eyes. Fate, it turned out, wasn't just a brilliant director but a mysterious benefactor, smiling at her from afar. That night, Amelia sat huddled in her tiny apartment, her weary eyes fixed on the peeling ceiling as if it were a map to navigate the storm raging within her. The events of the day, from the chaos at the hospital to the moment she saved a life in the park, weighed on her shoulders like an invisible giant, squeezing every breath. No job, no future, just a reckless, impulsive, yet deeply human choice that had plunged her into an abyss. The already cramped apartment seemed to shrink further, as if it wanted to swallow her into its terrifying stillness. The faint yellow glow from an old desk lamp cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, dancing like ghosts of her past mocking her. The occasional hum of the ancient fridge in the corner sounded like a mournful tune, a reminder of the emptiness in both her home and her stomach. She clutched a worn pillow to her chest, as if it were her last shield against the whirlwind of thoughts spinning in her mind. Would she ever work as a nurse again? Who would hire someone who brazenly defied hospital policy? An unwilling heroine now abandoned by the world she loved. Her stomach growled, a small but persistent sound, pulling her back to the harsh reality. After a day spent battling fate, she hadn't eaten a single bite. With a weary sigh, she dragged herself from the threadbare armchair and shuffled into the tiny kitchen, where only a few stale slices of bread and a nearly empty jar of peanut butter awaited. She barely noticed the faint rumble of engines in the distance, like the whisper of a strange wind. But the sound grew louder, deeper, more rhythmic, like the beat of an advancing army's drums. Amelia froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. This noise didn't belong to her quiet, working-class neighborhood, where the squeak of kids' bicycle horns drowned out even the delivery trucks. Curiosity mixed with unease, she stepped to the window, her trembling hand pulling aside the flimsy curtain. Her breath caught, as if someone had seized her throat. Before her, under the hazy streetlights, stood a row of sleek black luxury cars, lined up neatly like proud iron stallions awaiting their master's command. These weren't ordinary cars, no, these were the kind seen in glamorous Hollywood films, where powerful tycoons or billion-dollar stars stepped out with triumphant smiles. They gleamed under the orange glow, like giant jewels lost in this impoverished street. She wasn't the only one captivated by the sight. Curtains twitched in neighboring apartments, curious silhouettes peering out, whispering like sparrows before a storm. Amelia's heart raced faster, like a wild horse galloping in her chest. Who were they? What did they want? A sudden knock at the door, sharp and decisive, made her jump, her hand flying to her chest as if to keep her heart from leaping out. The knock came again, unhurried, unpanicked, but brimming with confidence, as if the person outside knew she'd answer. She hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorknob, her mind reeling with a dozen scenarios. Who could she call? The police? Friends? But she had no one. Taking a deep breath as if preparing to leap into a chasm, she turned the knob and opened the door. Standing before her was Nicholas Edward, the man she'd saved in the park just hours earlier. But now he was no longer a frail figure clutching his chest on the edge of death. He stood tall, regal as a king in a perfectly tailored suit, his polished shoes reflecting the hallway light. His complexion had regained its color, and his presence exuded a quiet, magnetic, and faintly intimidating power. Behind him, his assistant, equally sharp in an elegant suit, held a large envelope, his face impassive but his eyes glinting with curiosity. Nicholas offered a slight smile, a knowing one, as if he'd seen through her soul long ago. "Amelia," he said, his voice warm and rich like aged wine. "We need to talk." Amelia stood frozen, her mind blank as a wiped slate. This man, who'd once lain lifeless under her hands, was now vibrant and commanding, standing at her doorstep. She swallowed hard, stammering, Mr. Edward." He chuckled softly, a sound as soothing as waves lapping the shore, and shook his head. "Call me Nicholas, please." Awkwardly, she stepped aside, letting the two men enter. The contrast between them and her shabby apartment was almost laughably absurd. Nicholas's expensive suit and gleaming shoes brushing against the frayed rug, the rickety wooden table wobbling as if apologizing for its poverty. Amelia cleared her throat, trying to steady herself amid the whirlwind of emotions. "What's going on?" Nicholas turned, his gaze suddenly serious, deep as an ocean hiding secrets. "I never take chances with someone who's saved my life," he said, nodding to his assistant. The man stepped forward, handing her the envelope. Amelia's hands trembled as they brushed the thick, luxurious paper, something she'd only encountered in extravagant dreams. She slid her fingers under the flap, opened it, and her eyes nearly popped out at the first line. A check for $500,000. She read it again and again, as if the number might vanish if she blinked. $500,000. Her hands shook, her eyes darted to Nicholas, her voice faltering. I can't accept this." He tilted his head, a spark of amusement in his eyes. "You can and you will." Tears welled up hot and salty at the corners of her eyes. All day she'd lost everything. Her job, her security, her faith in the future. And now this man was handing her something beyond her wildest imagination. A blazing star in the pitch-black sky of her life. She clenched her teeth, trying to stifle the tidal wave of emotions, but it was futile. And then she cried, not dainty tears or soft sobs, but a deep raw wail that tore through every layer of resilience she'd built. Nicholas said nothing, simply standing there, watching quietly, like an old father seeing his daughter rediscover the light. As she sank into the threadbare armchair, still clutching the check, a strange sensation surged within her. For the first time since leaving the hospital, she didn't feel lost. She felt seen not just as a fired nurse, but as a person who'd made a difference. Before leaving, Nicholas placed a glossy black business card on the table, its gold lettering shimmering like a promise from another world. "Join me for dinner tomorrow 7 p.m. I'll send a car for you." His tone was gentle but firm, leaving no room for refusal. Amelia looked up, still dazed, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. He only smiled, the smile of someone who knew fate's game well. "Just dinner," he said, then turned and left, leaving her with a $500,000 check, a mysterious card, and a heart pounding with things she couldn't yet comprehend. As the door closed and the rumble of the luxury cars faded, she sat there, gazing at the card under the dim lamplight. Outside, the night remained vast and dark, but within her, a tiny spark had ignited. A spark of hope, of transformation, and of a story only just beginning. The following evening, Amelia sat curled up in the plush interior of a gleaming black car, her anxious hands clasped together like two small birds seeking shelter. The ride through the city was as smooth as a dream, the streets gliding by under the warm orange glow of streetlights, twinkling like fallen stars scattered across the earth. When the car finally came to a stop, she stepped out, her trembling legs meeting the ground, and looked up at the towering glass building before her. This wasn't a restaurant. No, this was a modern palace, a symbol of opulence she'd only glimpsed in fleeting dreams or on the glossy covers of magazines she'd never dared to buy. A waiter in a pristine white uniform greeted her with a polite nod, guiding her inside. The quiet elegance of the place enveloped her like a warm blanket. A gentle piano melody floated through the air, crystal chandeliers sparkled like suspended stars, and the faint aroma of exquisite food wafted by, so enticing she nearly forgot to breathe. Everything here was breathtakingly perfect, the tables draped in crisp white linens, delicate glassware as thin as mist, and tiny candles flickering in the dim light. Amelia felt like a duck among swans. Her simple green dress, clean and neat though it was, suddenly seemed rustic in this lavish setting. Nicholas was already waiting at a private corner near vast glass windows, where the city lights stretched out like a radiant tapestry. He looked up as she approached, a satisfied smile curling his lips, as if he were an artist who just completed a masterpiece. "Punctual, Amelia," he said, his voice deep and warm like the glass of red wine he held. She awkwardly slid into the chair across from him, suddenly aware of how small and out of place she felt before this man. He belonged to this world of power as naturally as a fish in water, his tailored suit and calm, commanding demeanor a perfect fit. "I have to admit," she began, struggling to keep her voice steady to mask the storm of nerves within. "I almost didn't come." Nicholas chuckled softly, the sound ringing like a small bell in the hushed space, then raised his glass. "I don't blame you." A waiter appeared silently, pouring wine into her glass with an artist's precision, then setting down an appetizer so exquisite she wondered if it was meant to be eaten or admired like a museum painting. Everything here was costly, flawless, and somehow distant from the life she'd known. Nicholas folded his hands on the table, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Tell me, Amelia, what drives you? What do you want most in life?" The question caught her off guard, her brows knitting together as if she'd been pulled into a chess game without knowing the rules. I just want to help people," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "That's why I became a nurse." He nodded, his gaze fixed on her as if peering through her outer shell. "And yet you risked your entire career for a stranger." Her throat tightened, memories of that day crashing over her like a tidal wave. The erratic beeps, blood pooling on the floor, and the reckless decision that changed everything. "I couldn't stand by and watch someone die," she whispered, as if justifying it to herself. Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes sharp as a scalpel. "That's exactly why you're here." Amelia blinked, her mind spinning like a runaway wheel. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly, twirling his wine glass as if toying with fate. "What if I told you I own a chain of private hospitals?" Her eyes widened, the name Edward flashing in her mind like lightning. She'd heard it somewhere, but never connected the dots. He wasn't just wealthy. He was a titan. "For years," Nicholas continued, his voice low like an ancient tale, "I've been searching for someone different, someone with integrity, who puts people above policy." He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving her. "I've tested dozens of doctors, managers, experts. Most hesitated, many turned a blind eye. But you," he paused, their gazes locking like two flames meeting. "You acted without hesitation, not even knowing who I was. That's the kind of person I need." Amelia's heart pounded like a war drum, her throat parched. "Need for what?" Nicholas set his glass down, his smile now carrying the confidence of someone who knew the next move. "I want you to lead a new healthcare initiative. Fully funded, your vision. Build the team, set the rules, no bureaucracy, just pure medicine." Her head spun as if caught in a whirlwind. Was this a dream or reality? I don't understand, she stammered, her voice wavering like a candle in the wind. Are you offering me a hospital? He laughed, the sound warm as morning sun. I'm offering you a purpose, a platform to do what you do best, with no one holding you back. The weight of his words pressed on her shoulders like a mountain, yet felt as light as a promise. Just a day ago she'd lost everything. Now he was handing her a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Nicholas leaned back, watching her with the patience of an old teacher awaiting a student's answer. So, Amelia, what do you say? She didn't reply immediately, her mind still suspended between reality and a dream. The dinner passed in lighter conversation, but her thoughts drifted far, lost in contemplation. Back in her small apartment, Amelia sat alone under the faint golden glow of her old desk lamp. The city outside buzzed with life, honking horns and distant laughter forming an endless melody. But in this room everything was still like a frozen lake in winter. On the small wooden table, the $500,000 check lay quietly yet proudly, like a king awaiting its crown. $500,000, a sum that could change everything. Escape this cramped apartment with its peeling walls and musty smell, pay off debts, or even fly somewhere far away to start anew. But it still didn't feel real, like a gift from the heavens she didn't dare touch. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the ceiling, where cracks told stories of hard years. Memories flickered like an old film. The sharp scent of antiseptic in the hospital, the steady beeps of machines, the helpless eyes of patients who trusted her. She recalled that fateful moment, the gunshot victim on the stretcher, blood pooling crimson, her trembling hands steadying with resolve. Her colleagues stood frozen, but she acted no matter the cost. Not for money, she murmured, her gaze returning to the check. She'd never done it for money. Her thoughts shifted to Nicholas, how he'd looked at her during dinner, not with judgment but with curiosity, like an archaeologist uncovering a treasure buried deep. I never take chances with someone who's saved my life, he'd said, and now she understood. He didn't just see her skills but something greater, compassion, courage, things money couldn't buy. Amelia rubbed her face, exhaustion seeping into her bones, yet her heart thrummed with excitement. This was a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. She could take the money and vanish, leaving behind the stress and silent sacrifices. Or she could step in, to a hospital unbound by rules, where she could save lives without shackles. She closed her eyes, images rising. An elderly woman grasping her hand after a tough case, a boy scribbling a drawing calling her super nurse, families weeping with joy because she didn't give up. This wasn't about money, it was about purpose, the reason she lived. When she opened her eyes, her decision shone clear as moonlight through the dark. She wouldn't run. She would build, not just a hospital but a legacy of compassion. With a tired but resolute smile, Amelia stood, ready to step into the next chapter of her life. The sun had just risen, its first rays slipping through the thin curtains, spilling gold across Amelia's tiny apartment. The city outside was still drowsy, the quiet streets occasionally stirred by the hum of passing cars, like lazy notes in a morning symphony. Amelia reached for her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage from the fresh dawn air. Her fingers brushed over Nicholas's glossy black business card, its gold lettering shimmering like a whisper of fate. The phone rang only twice before his voice came through, calm and alert, not a trace of sleepiness despite the early hour. "Nicholas here," he said, his tone warm as a morning coffee. Amelia swallowed hard, gripping the phone as if it might slip away. I'm in," she blurted, then let out a small, clumsy laugh, raw but genuine. "A wise choice, Amelia," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She exhaled, a wave of relief escaping her chest. For the first time since walking out of the hospital that day, she didn't feel lost. She felt she was standing exactly where fate had drawn her, like a bird finally finding its nest after a long storm. Months passed, yet that feeling lingered like a dream she hadn't woken from. Now Amelia stood before the entrance of a sleek, modern hospital, gleaming like a jewel in the heart of the city. Her heart pounded not from fear but from awe and pride. She looked up at the sign mounted by the glass doors. Amelia Healthcare Initiative, saving lives without limits. Her name, her vision, etched into the shining metal under the morning sun. This building wasn't just an architectural marvel with its polished design. It was a symbol of a quiet revolution, a place where no one would be turned away, no paperwork would block the path, no approvals would delay care, just pure medicine, just humans helping humans. She took a deep breath, feeling the sweet weight of this moment settle on her shoulders like a royal cloak. She'd started this journey as an ordinary nurse, fired for daring to do what was right, and now she stood here, poised to change lives in ways even her boldest dreams hadn't touched. As she stepped inside, a surge of emotion welled up in her chest, warm and fierce like a newly kindled flame. The reception area greeted her with a rare friendliness, unlike the cold, sterile hospital lobbies she'd known. The walls were adorned with gentle artwork, soft pastel colors replacing harsh warning signs. Natural light poured through large windows, illuminating everything like a promise of hope. She walked down the hallway, her eyes catching scenes that made her heart pulse with every beat. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, but without tension or fear. There were no anxious whispers about insurance, no patients abandoned for empty pockets. In one room, a boy with a faint smile reached out as a nurse adjusted his pillow, his mother clutching his hand, her eyes shimmering with relief and gratitude. In another, an elderly man chatted with a doctor who truly listened. No rushing, no glancing at the clock, just presence. Amelia swallowed a lump in her throat, tears threatening to spill. This was why she'd fought, why she'd said yes to Nicholas, not for glory but for these small sacred moments. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. Quite a sight, isn't it? She turned to see Nicholas Edward standing there, hands in his pockets, his suit as impeccable as a painting. But today, something different flickered in his eyes. Not just his usual confidence, but pride tinged with respect, like a father watching a child he'd nurtured come into her own. Amelia smiled, her lips trembling slightly. "It's more than I ever dreamed." He tilted his head, studying her for a moment, then nodded toward the hallway. "Walk with me." They strolled together slowly like old friends, taking in the life unfolding around them. The soft laughter of a child, the gentle murmur of a nurse, the faint scent of antiseptic mingling with coffee from the break room. It all wove into a symphony of life. "I knew you were the right choice from the start," Nicholas said after a pause, his voice deep as a steady river. "The moment you put your career on the line for a stranger, I knew." Amelia glanced at him, her eyes glistening. "I didn't do it for recognition." He chuckled, a sound as warm as sunlight through leaves. "I know. That's why you're here." They stopped before a glass door leading to her private office. Inside, a polished wooden desk awaited, flanked by a neat stack of medical journals like loyal soldiers, a sleek laptop, and a pristine stethoscope resting there like an invitation to step into her new role. Nicholas gestured toward the door, his eyes alight. "Ready?" Amelia took a deep breath, gazing around the hospital, her dream now tangible, vibrant, and more radiant than any picture she'd painted in her mind. She'd lost everything, but in that loss she'd found something greater. A purpose, a legacy. She met Nicholas's gaze and smiled. Not the hesitant smile of yesterday, but the smile of someone ready. "More than ever," she replied, her voice steady as a bell ringing in a cathedral. As the door closed behind her, the morning light streamed through the office window, bathing the stethoscope in a small halo. Outside, the city was waking up, but in this moment it was just her and the dream made real. Sometimes losing everything isn't the end, but the first step toward heights you never dared imagine. Amelia's journey from a fired nurse to a pioneer changing lives stands as proof that compassion, though costly, always finds a way to shine. And if this story stirs your heart, if you find yourself smiling at Amelia's resilience or pondering Nicholas's quiet test, leave a thought below. How would you rate this journey on a scale of 10? How do you feel about the ending? A new beginning amidst old losses. And if you were Amelia, what would you do at that fateful crossroads? Let's chat. I'm listening from the other side of the screen, where stories like this live on in our hearts.